going to continue the complementarian egalitarian debate, and today I'm going to do something a little strange. I'm stepping away from my normal egalitarian shoes, and I'm going to defend a complementarian view. I often ask my students at Covenant Theological Seminary to do this because I truly believe that it helps you to increase your unbiased knowledge of something and arrive at the truth. So if I were a complementarian, here is where I would go. So first of all, both sides believe that gender is ordained by God. Women and men have equal value, and any kind of abuse within these relationships is sin. Complementarians believe men and women complement each other in their giftings and roles, but see men to be given a servant leader position by God to lead their family and the church as the head. Egalitarians believe women and men have equal authority in the church and marriage and would encourage interchangeable roles according to best gifting. So, here's some great reasons to be a complementarian. The first one is that if you look at all of history, you start with the very beginning of time and you come right up till now, males have been in charge. They've led almost everything. I mean, granted, there's been queens and, minor pictures here and there, but for the most part, culturally in leadership, it's been men, and maybe that suggests a biblical design. The second reason is that men and women seem to have been created differently. In other words, there are differences between a man and a woman other than just simple anatomy. They seem to be different. Some people describe this as pink and blue. We think differently, we do things differently, we function a little bit differently. The third reason is because Adam was made first. When you read the story in Genesis 1:26 through 28, you get the idea that they're equal as image bearers, that they have the same inherent value before God, but it almost comes off as if Eve was an afterthought. Did you ever think about it that way? In other words, if I were writing the story, if I was God and I was an egalitarian at the core, I think I would have written it differently. Maybe they would have been the same people with dual reproductive organs or something like that. But when I read the story, it just seems like a man is a man and a woman is a woman, and they're different, and that should mean something. It's also interesting that Adam has the role of naming all of the animals, and then Eve comes along and he's given the same role, which might also infer this leadership or dominating over her in the same way that he did the animals, or likewise. Now granted, she is in the image of God and the animals aren't, but it's the same kind of language and sort of seems to infer the same thing. Now here's another thing to consider. When you look at the biblical narrative, it doesn't really matter whether you go to the Old Testament or the New Testament. When you look at the people that lead, it's nearly always men. And so you're going to get some woman in here. I'm not going to deny that. You're going to get Deborah and Huldah and Mary Magdalene and Priscilla and Phoebe and Junia. But they're going to be a very minor picture. And again, if God is truly egalitarian, if that's the mindset that he's going into, don't you think that that picture would be a little more tilted? Don't you think it would at least be like 1/3, 2/3, or why not 50-50? We are talking about God here. And then the next question there is Levitical priests. So when I look at Levitical priests, I look at an early picture of Israel and I say, what was God's ideal? That's kind of what he's giving Moses. He's to an extent meeting broken Egyptian ruled people here, but he's still establishing things where we can see his ideals. And so he puts the Levitical priests in charge, and there are no women, which is very interesting to me. In the same way, when Christ chooses disciples, there are no women disciples. Why wouldn't he pick 1 or 3 or again 6 and 6? I mean, Christ didn't seem to worry about stepping on a lot of toes. He was way countercultural to his age. He offended a lot of people. if that was the way that God wanted things, why wouldn't Jesus have set the record straight with it? What about the Pauline epistles? A lot of egalitarians look at those and, they want them to be, they want to say Paul was egalitarian. And when I read the major epistles, I'll do 1 Corinthians 11, 2, 14:33, Colossians 3:18, Ephesians 5:21, 1 Timothy 2:9, 1 Peter 3 you could even put in there. When I read them plainly in English, I just take out my Bible and read it. It really seems to read as if it's suggesting that there's a difference between men and women. So again, I'm going to go back to that plainly read thing that I described earlier. If you're going to plainly read the writings of Paul, it would seem that men are put in a place of leadership or authority in the church, and that they are also to lead their households as Christ, the head of the church, leads his believers as one. So if that weren't the case, it would seem like it would be written differently. For instance, why would he ever kind of talk about one thing to husbands and another to wives? Why wouldn't he just group them together? Husbands and wives, do this. Now, I hate to even bring this up, but there is another perspective on this. The other perspective is sometimes people say, well, you have to know Greek to get to the bottom of it. And so if you were to do an exegetical Greek study, really get into exactly what the Greek says. I understand that there's a pronoun thing going on there that's different, but even if you get into it and you start to study that, you might say, all right, this is a little bit more complex than I thought. Maybe Paul is an egalitarian. So as a good complementarian defense, are you ready for this? I would be okay just saying Paul is egalitarian. What if it's just the author's perspective that's egalitarian? We don't necessarily get thus saith the Lord anywhere in here. And so this is considered a texture of interpretation that the authors are going to have some kind of, preconceived notion into the text. So some people are going to have a hard time going there, but I'm just saying that is one consideration in this debate. All right, so my last consideration is Jesus. We get to the New Testament and, sometimes we get this idea that in the Old Testament things got misinterpreted or just were read differently than maybe God intended. And so Jesus comes along, and the correct answer is always Jesus. He sets the record straight. And so my question is, if God wanted things to be more egalitarian, and Jesus wasn't afraid to offend or buck the system or something like that, why didn't Jesus just come right out as an egalitarian? In fact, why wouldn't he just have, like a Sermon on the Mount moment and just preach the egalitarian mindset? He might have even prefaced it of, I know we don't live like this, but this is the ideal. This is the way things should be according to God. Why don't we get Jesus preach that? And why don't we get him picking a whole bunch of women disciples while he's at it? It just seems to me that if the story or the narrative was really meant to teach an egalitarian perspective, wouldn't it be written a little differently? Wouldn't Jesus have defined it differently to go that way? So if I were a complementarian, I think these are excellent arguments to make every egalitarian really consider where they stand. May God bless you and keep you.